Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. As the battle over budgets and fiscal responsibility rages in D.C., Catholic social teaching is often invoked. Is it moral to cut benefits to the needy even when funds are tight? Is this government shutdown moral? Is the concept of limited government and economic liberty somehow at odds with church teaching? My next guest has examined the question in his new book, Tea Party Catholic: The Catholic Case for Limited Government, a Free Economy, and Human Flourishing. He's also the research director at the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. Please welcome Sam Gregg to the program. Sam, why title this book Tea Party Catholic? There are a lot of people who take a very dim view of Tea Party. It has a political connotation. And to conflate that with Catholicism, some say, you're dividing people in the church.
Well, the book itself has very little to do with the Tea Party movement. In fact, I say that right at the beginning. What the book is about is talking about the American experiment in ordered liberty, and I use the phrase Tea Party because it harks back to things that Americans resonate with, things like the Boston Tea Party, the American Revolution, the American experiment. But the Catholic part is about showing how Catholics were, first of all, very involved in the American Revolution, much more than most people realize, that they were involved in shaping the American experience and the American experiment as we know it today. But it's also talking about how Catholics can inject some new ideas into ideas about limited government, about economic liberty, about religious freedom, which, of course, some people would say are three things that are under enormous stress today. So that's really the essence of the book, to get to this connection between the American experiment and Catholicism. And I think that's something that Catholics generally need to talk more about.
Early on, you invoked Charles Carroll, the
Yes.
only Catholic signatory to the Declaration of Independence. What was his attitude about markets and economic liberty? And what are we missing there in that very early Catholic example, if you will, of someone at the founding?
Well, what most people don't know is that he was, at the time, the wealthiest American in the United States. So financially speaking, he had a lot to lose if the revolution had gone south.
Didn't work, yeah.
It didn't work out. He was in big trouble. But more importantly, he had a view of the nature of government. He had very clear economic views, which we would describe today as more or less pro-market. But more importantly, I think, he had a vision of what this new republic was going to be about. And he saw it as one of an empire. He used the phrase empire of liberty. And what he meant by that was a society in which freedom, properly understood, would flourish. And his understanding of freedom wasn't autonomy for the sake of autonomy or liberty for the sake of liberty. He had a very rich conception, a Catholic conception of what freedom is about. And ultimately, freedom for Catholics is about excellence. So he would use language like the Republic of Virtue to describe his vision of what he thought America would be like. And that's very important language because lots of other founders use that same type of language as well.
Now, you draw out this connection between economic liberty and religious freedom, something that we're hearing a great deal about today, heard about earlier in the show. Draw that out a bit for us, and then I want to get to some who might take a contrary view.
Sure.
To Sam Gregg. Go ahead.
Well, when it comes to the connection between economic and religious liberty, I think today, with the expansion of government into the economy, we're seeing that when you diminish liberty in one sphere of life, it tends to have negative implications, sometimes intended, sometimes unintended, for other forms of liberty. So if you expand the welfare state, as we've seen happen over the past, well, let's say 8 years, and you have a welfare state that has a vision of the human person that's quite antithetical to the Catholic vision of the person. So today's welfare state, I think, is very much based upon a type of view of the person as a rather hedonistic being, as someone who needs to be taken care of, someone who's driven by desires rather than reason. And when that comes into a clash with what people believe as a matter of religious faith to be true, then you've got religious liberty effectively being crowded out by a growing welfare state. But it's not just an intellectual crowding out, it's also a practical one as well, because the welfare state consumes resources and it takes up space that used to be occupied by by many religious associations. So in other words, religious liberty isn't just about my right and your right to exercise our conscience. It's also about the freedoms of religious communities, which Dignitatis Humanae specifically talks about. So I think that's part of the problem. And it's not just literally things like Obamacare, it's also things like when Catholic organizations start taking large amounts of money from the government. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that the priorities of the organization, even if it's staffed by very good Catholic people, can often start shifting away from the people they're trying to help and much more upon how do I get
secure that grant? Yeah, securing that grant. I want to put a few things before you. When people heard you were coming on, I was inundated with emails, and one of them contained the following quote. Now, this is Pope Francis. He said this when he was in Sardinia in September. "We don't want this globalized economic system, which does us so much harm. Men and women have to be at the center of an economic system as God wants, not money. The world has become an idolater of this God called money. It is not a problem of Italy and Europe. It is the consequence of a world choice of an economic system that brings about this tragedy, an economic system that has at its center an idol, which is called money." He seems to be condemning profit and a profit-focused market. Your response?
Well, I think there's several things that are going on in that statement. First of all, I think he's reflecting the experience of many Latin Americans of globalization, which has not been in some cases a very happy experience. He comes from Argentina, which of course went through a huge financial meltdown back in 2001. He's also reflecting, I think, genuine distress that you find in countries of Europe where you have enormously high youth unemployment rates, for example. But the question is, has globalization helped the poor overall, or has it hurt them? Now, if you look at a region like East Asia, something like 850 million people have escaped poverty. 850 million people. That's a lot of people. Why? Because they've integrated themselves into the global economy. So I think many of the countries that he's probably referring to, such as in Latin America and in Europe, they are experiencing what happens when you globalize an economy. Things get more competitive. You have to work harder. You can't have big welfare states like we used to have anymore. So I think these are internal things that, frankly, many countries in Latin America and Western Europe simply aren't willing to adjust to. And as a consequence, they're starting to pay a price for it.
Let's talk for a moment about Pope Benedict, his encyclical in 2009 on charity. And he said, "A true world political authority is needed to oversee the economy and work for the common good." Now, that is clearly an outside international entity imposing its will on free economies. How does that square with the philosophy you're advancing?
Well, of course, it doesn't square in some senses, because I think that much depends upon what you mean by a world authority. And if you look at that encyclical, you find that he's very, very careful when it comes to defining what exactly he means by a world authority. And in fact, I think it was back in 2012, he made some comments basically saying that it could mean, doesn't necessarily have to be a coercive body. It can be a body, he said, ruled by reason, in which people came together to make collective decisions about things. So I think a lot depends on what is cashed out by what we mean by world authority. We have international institutions right now. We have the United Nations, we have the IMF, we have the World Bank, which already assume a certain degree of influence over the global economy. But here's the problem. The problem is that a centralized world authority simply could not know enough about what's going on in the global economy at any one point in time to be able to make anything but the broadest decisions possible about what goes on in the economy.
So you're suggesting that supposition, that idea advanced by the Pope violates subsidiarity?
Well, he goes on and says in that very same encyclical, he says now this world authority would have to operate according to the principle of subsidiarity, because he knows, I mean, he's from a person who grew up in Nazi Germany. He knows what centralized power looks like. He's also been someone who, especially before he became Pope, was rather critical of certain aspects of the European Union and some of its centralizing tendencies. So I think both popes actually, when it comes down to it, when it comes to the very concrete, detailed things, when it comes to economic policy or monetary policy, both of them have said, including Pope Francis, that this is primarily a responsibility of lay people, and that lay people, to a certain extent, are free to legitimately disagree about these sorts of issues. And I'm hoping that this book, Tea Party Catholic, will stimulate some debate about some things that I think maybe haven't been debated enough within the church.
We are in the midst of a shutdown here in Washington, D.C.
I noticed.
And yeah, both parties are grappling with the financial reality hitting home. You have an entitlement state that has exploded. They simply don't have the revenue to continue at this pace. And you've got a healthcare regime that now has entered the picture. Every time these arguments begin on Capitol Hill, no doubt Catholics come to the fore. Half of them say we've got to be fiscally responsible. We must cut away at these entitlement programs. And then another group of Catholics, you call them social justice Catholics in your book, they come up and say, wait a minute, that's immoral. You are hurting the needy and the poorest of the poor. Your message to them in the middle of this showdown, is it moral to make those sorts of draconian cuts in some instances?
Well, you know, I think a lot would depend upon which particular programs we're talking about, who would affect. But here's the thing. It seems to me that it's much more consistent with the founding, the American founding with the American experiment, that when it comes to helping those in need, our first recourse should not be the government. It should be individuals, it should be families, it should be religious associations, it should be churches. When Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote that great book, Democracy in America, came here in the 19th century, he observed that when it came to helping problems, helping people get out of their problems, it was religious associations and individuals did it, not governments. And maybe that's something that we need to be thinking about. Instead of expecting governments to take care of so many of these problems for us, maybe it's time for us as a church to be saying, no, that's something that we Christians need to be doing. In fact, Benedict XVI was very clear about this in a number of his encyclicals, that there's something that the welfare state can't give people. It's called loving personal concern. Welfare states can't do that. And there are situations, he said, of extreme need that cry out, not for another welfare payment, but for loving personal concern.
So you would say those cuts to some of those entitlement programs are moral?
I would need to know which ones we're talking about and how far the cuts go.
Very good. Sam Gregg, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Raymond.
And the book is Tea Party Catholic, The Catholic Case for Limited Government, a Free Economy, and Human Flourishing. You can get it at bookstores everywhere and online. You can read Sam Gregg's columns at acton.org.